Hey, this is James with Twisted Hobbies, and in this video we're going to be covering how to build the Hacker Model Supreme. This video is going to follow step by step with the provided manual, and you'll hear me reference it throughout the video. So first step is to inventory all of the parts. You should check everything's there and also make sure nothing's been damaged in shipping. You can cross-reference the list of parts found on page 6 of the manual. Next, you're going to gather all the servos and the servo parts listed 18-1. We're going to be using the short control arms. Next, we're going to cut out the control arm extenders. Now we're going to assemble the control horns with the extenders. There's two ways we can do this. We can either wrap the string around it and support it with some glue, as shown in the manual, or we can do what I'm doing here, which is take two of the screws, screw them all the way through, and then once assembled, we're going to secure it with a little extra CA. So we have the 4 control horns now assembled. As I mentioned, I'm just going to take a bit of CA and put a bit on each side just to secure everything. For this next step, we'll need to center all the servos. You can do this with a servo tester, or you can use a regular radio receiver and a controller. Once we have each servo centered, we can attach the control horn. For this, we'll want to reference the figure in step 5. So for each of the ailerons and then the rudder and the elevator, we want to make sure everything's aligned correctly. Next, we're going to cut the supporting fabric into 16 2x1 centimeter pieces. In step 7, it actually asks to fold all the control surface hinges and keep them weighed down for a couple hours, but we found this isn't actually quite necessary. We're going to take the pieces we've cut out and we're going to glue one to the very end on each of the control surfaces on each side using foam glue. Now, without gluing anything, we're going to take Spar 37 and Spar 39, and we're going to fit them both on the top of the elevator. Now we're going to glue the spars in using a thin layer of CA glue along the top. So now we'll flip it over and do the same thing on the other side. We're going to get Spar 37 and the two shorter Spar 38s. We're first going to fit them without gluing anything. Now we're going to go ahead and glue them in with a thin layer of CA. So now we'll decide if we want to build the Supreme with detachable wings or not. In this video we're going to cover how to build it with the detachable wings. If you'd like to just glue everything together, then there are detailed instructions in the manual on how to do so. So we're going to sand both sides of these laser etched pieces, and then we're going to cut out parts 16.4 and 16.5. Now we're going to assemble the wing support system. We're going to take the two part 16.5s and fit them to part 16.4. And then we're going to use CA glue to attach everything together. We'll want to make sure this is nice and square, so use some sort of 90-degree surface to make sure that everything lines up correctly. Once dried, we're going to fit the wing support system into the fuselage. We'll use Spar 10 to line everything up. Now we're going to fit the wing spar supports into the wing. So we'll want to make sure the notches in each piece are aligned in a nice straight line, as the spars are going to fit right into those slots. Now we're going to fit both wings to the fuselage, and once everything's fit nicely, we're going to glue in the wing support pieces. So since we'll be building the Supreme with detachable wings, we're going to cut the wing spars into two 455mm long pieces. You can discard the scraps as we don't need them. Now we'll want to mark and cut a slot about 4 millimeters deep along the bottom of each of the wings. This is where the carbon spar is going to fit. You'll notice the line will actually go right along where the black edge of the wing meets the white. Once the slot's cut, we're going to take those spars we've just cut and we're going to fit them in there. Once we know everything fits, we'll glue in the carbon spars with a thin layer of CA along the top. Now we'll repeat the same thing for the other wing. Now we're going to repeat the same process on the top side of the wing. Now we're going to test fit the two wing mounts on each of the wings. We'll use Spar 10 as a guide. Once in place, we're going to mark where the two slots are on the front and back of the mount. And then we're going to remove the mount and we're going to cut about a 5 millimeter deep slot on each side. Now we'll take the wing mounts and we'll sand the side that's attaching to the wing. Using Spar 10 as a guide, we'll glue the wing mounts on with a layer of CA all the way around. We'll want to make sure the wing mounts are parallel with the wing cord. Now we're going to test fit the parts listed 16-6 into the fuselage. Now we're going to test fit the wings against the fuselage, using Spar 10 as a guide. We'll want to check that the wing cord is perfectly aligned with the fuselage. Now we'll want to glue in part 16-6. So it's easiest to leave the wing on and add a bit of glue to hold the part in place so that we know everything is perfectly aligned. And then we can remove the wing and glue the rest of it on. Now we'll test fit the wings to the fuselage once more. And we'll test fit the connection with an O-ring to make sure everything fits correctly. Now we're going to gather the fuselage parts, including the 2 long carbon beams, part 42, the 4 shorter ones, labeled part 41, and also the motor mount. If you'd like, you can color the motor mount black so that it actually matches the rest of the fuselage a little better. Now we're going to test fit the carbon beams 42 into each side of the bottom of the fuselage. Now we'll glue in the 2 carbon beams with a thin layer of CA across the top. Now we're going to test fit the 2 shorter carbon beams into the front on the bottom of the fuselage. We'll use the motor mount as a guide. Now we'll glue in the 2 short carbon beams with a thin layer of CA along the top. We want to be sure not to get any glue on the motor mount. Now we're going to test fit the 2 shorter beams on the top of the fuselage at the front, using the motor mount as a guide. And now we're going to glue in the 2 carbon beams at the front and the top, remembering not to get any glue on the motor mount. So now we're going to assemble the landing gear. So first we'll need to gather parts 18-4, 19, and part 21. We're going to sand just one side of part 19 and part 21. And we're going to sand both sides of the 4 parts 18-4. Now we'll gather parts 9, 11, 12, 24, 25, and 26. We're going to drill a 3mm hole into each of the landing gear struts. We'll want it to be as centered as possible at the bottom. So now we're going to screw in bolt 24 and the other parts that hold on the landing gear wheels. There's a great figure in the manual on exactly how to do this. Once we have the bolt and 2 of the nuts in place on the landing gear, we'll go ahead and add the landing gear wheels. You may want to drill out the hole a bit on each of the landing wheels so that they spin freely on each of the bolts. Now we'll glue the wheel cover to the landing gear. We'll want to make sure the wheel spins freely within the wheel cover. Now we're going to test fit parts 18-4 and 19 into the fuselage. Now we're going to glue just along the inside edges of part 19 with a thin layer of CA. Now, one at a time, we're going to test fit the landing gear assembly to the fuselage. We'll do this using screw 27 and washer 28. Once the landing gear is in place, we're going to use a drop of CA to secure the two parts 18-4 on each side of the fuselage. Once secured, we're going to remove the landing gear assembly, and we're going to add a bit more CA to each of the parts 18-4 to secure them. Once the four parts 18-4 are all glued in, we'll add some additional CA all the way around part 19 to secure it. We'll also add some additional CA on top of the fuselage where the parts 18-4 poke through to hold them on the other side. Now we're going to test fit part 2 of the fuselage to the bottom of part 3. Now using foam glue, in this case I'm going to use foam tack, we're going to add a thin layer on each side of the pieces where they meet. And now, just like whenever we use foam tack, the best way to use it is to push the two pieces together and then immediately pull them apart and hold them apart for about 10 seconds. After 10 seconds, we'll then push the parts back together to finally glue together. We're going to test fit the two part 8 pieces to the side of the fuselage. We'll notice that they taper actually, and that the thinner side is going to go towards the back of the fuselage. Now we'll glue the two pieces on using foam tack. Again, we'll push the two pieces together, pull them apart for about 10 seconds, and then securely fit them together. Now we're going to test fit the elevator, part 6, to the fuselage. Now I'm going to glue on part 6 using foam tack. In the manual I believe it says to use a thin layer of CA on the top and bottom, but I think foam tack works well. Now, repeating the same process that we used for the bottom fuselage piece, we're going to glue part 1 to the rest of the fuselage. Now we're finally going to glue the motor mount to the rest of the fuselage using a thin layer of CA all the way around. Now we're going to cut out the two balsa tail pieces, part 13. First we'll test fit the top balsa piece, which is the one that has the holes cut in it. Once fit, we'll add a thin layer of CA all the way around to secure it. Now we'll test fit the solid balsa piece to the bottom of the fuselage and secure it with a good layer of CA. Now we're going to test fit part 7 to the fuselage. Now we're going to glue part 7 to the rest of the fuselage. We're going to use foam glue, and we'll start at the top and work our way around. And just like whenever we use foam tack, we're going to push the pieces together and lift them apart slightly for about 10 seconds, and then we'll push them securely together. Now we'll fit and glue piece 20 to the bottom of the fuselage on the tail balsa piece. Now we're going to gather the control parts 16-1, 18-2, 18-3, and 29. Next we're going to screw the ball joints into all of the control horns. Now we're going to start with the rudder, and we're going to glue the control horn onto the left side of the rudder using a thin layer of CA, and we'll want the ball joint to be on top. Now we're going to glue another control horn to the top side of the elevator with the ball joint facing in. We're also going to add some more supporting CA to the other side of the rudder control horn. We'll also want to add some supporting glue to the bottom side of the elevator control horn. Now we're going to fit the pushrod guides 16-7 and 16-8 into the fuselage. Now we're going to test fit the rudder and elevator servos. Now we'll glue in the two servos. I like using just a couple drops of thumbtack. So now we'll want to prepare the push rods. First we'll want to gather the push rods 35 and 36. And we're going to sand about 1 centimeter on each of the push rods. Now we're going to take our 4 sanded push rods and we're going to glue part 31 onto the end of each one using CA. Once glued, we'll clamp part 31 down to secure it onto the push rod. Now we'll take each of our push rods and we're going to screw them into part 31. Now we're going to insert the elevator push rod into the push rod guides. And we're going to insert the pin into the servo control link, but we're not going to push the pin all the way in. Next, we're going to want to make sure the elevator is perfectly parallel with the fuselage. Then we're going to measure about 8 millimeters from the end of the control horn. And we're going to cut the push rod. The easiest way to do this is take an X-Acto knife and just roll the push rod along a flat surface with the knife on top. Once cut, we're going to sand the push rod again, and we're going to glue it into the push rod guide using a layer of CA. Once glued in and secured, we can actually push the pin into the control horn clevis. Now we're going to repeat the same process for the rudder push rod. Once the push rods are installed, we can actually glue in all of the push rod guides with a thin layer of CA. We want to be very careful not to get any glue on the push rod itself. Now we can go ahead and install the landing gear. We'll want to check that the landing gear are aligned correctly. Now we're going to gather the motor, ESC, propeller, and the screws 27. We're going to screw the motor to the motor mount with screws 27. Now we'll attach the motor to the ESC, and we'll want to make sure the motor is spinning in the correct direction for the propeller that we're using. Now we can attach the ESC to the fuselage. In this case I use a thin layer of foam tack, but strong double-sided tape works well too. Now we'll gather our radio receiver and servo extensions. Now we'll want to install the Aileron servo extension cables. They thread through the two slots found on each side of the fuselage. Now with a bit of CA, we'll just want to glue each of the aileron extension cables into the sides of the fuselage. Now we'll connect our rudder servo, our elevator servo, and our ESC to the radio. The radio receiver can be stored within the black diagonal support strips at the back. Now we're going to configure the wing control surfaces. So we'll need the wing servos, push rods 35, and parts 16.1 and 29. We're going to cut small slots in the wings for the servo arms. Now we're going to install the servos with a couple drops of foam tack. Now we'll install the control horns on each of the wings using a thin layer of CA. Now we're going to attach push rod 35 to each of the servos. We're going to insert the pin, but do not push it all the way into the clevis. Now we'll want to make sure the ailerons are nice and flat, and we're going to cut push rod 35 about 8 millimeters from the end of the control horn. Next, we're going to sand the end of push rod 35. Then we're going to glue it into the control horn. Then we're going to glue it into the end of the control horn with some CA. Once finished, we can push the pin into the control horn clevis. Now we're going to repeat the same process for the other wing. Now we're going to gather carbon rod 34, and we're going to bevel down one side of each rod. Now we're actually going to secure the carbon rod to each of these servo wires. The way this can be done is by attaching a small strip of electrical tape to the end of the servo wire, and with a small layer of CA, attaching the other end of the carbon rod to the male end of the servo connector. Now we're going to insert the extra servo wire into the wing. If you're having trouble doing this, it's definitely worth shortening the servo wires so that they fit in nicely without crunching everything up. Now we're going to insert rod 10 back into the fuselage, and we're going to attach each wing to the fuselage. We're going to take the servo leads from each wing, and we're going to plug them into the servo extenders that we glued into the fuselage. Next, we'll secure the wings with O-rings. And we'll want to check everything is securely fastened. Now, since we'll probably want to store the battery on top, we're going to cut a small hole for the ESC power cable to slip through the fuselage. Now we'll fit the propeller to the motor. If you have a propeller spinner, you can attach that now as well. Now we can find the correct location and Velcro down our battery to the fuselage. We'll want to make sure the CG lines up correctly. The CG on this model is between 275 and 285 millimeters from the front of the fuselage. And the last step is to configure the radio and then go flying. If you have any further questions on this model, you can always email us or find us on rcgroups.com.